So we're gonna cover what it means by render layer. So basically, what render layer is that it's just a layer system that artists use to organize the rendering result, which then can be used for compositing stage later on. So let's say you are supposed to render this particular scenery. Okay, so it's a Japanese castle with some bushes and trees and cliff. Okay, so a good approach to render this large scenery is that you break down the object into different rendering layer. Okay, so for the object that is in the front, okay, we're gonna put in render layer 1, and for the object that is in the middle ground, we're gonna put into render layer 2, and for the object that is at the background, we're gonna put in the render layer 3. Okay, so each of these layer will produce just this particular object. So for example, render layer 1 will only produce these bushes and a tree, and render layer 2 only this object, and for render layer 3 only produce the cliff. And then at the end of the day, the artist is going to put this all together, maybe in Photoshop or After Effects. Okay, now when it comes to render layer, just be aware that there are many ways of doing it. So the idea is that we're not going to render everything in one layer. So the idea is a separation of layer. Okay, now in this picture, right, this is just an example. So render layer 3, right, and this is all the final result being put together, and this is layer 1, layer 2, layer 3, and this is the composite or the final one. Okay, so a different project may have a different requirement and a certain way of doing things. So this is just one example on how people utilize the feature of render layer in Maya. Okay, so this is another setup or another usage of how people do render layer. So the layer is actually categorized by light. Okay, so as compared to this one, so in this approach, we actually categorize the layer by object. Okay, so for all the object that is in front, we're gonna put in this foreground layer or layer 1. Object in the middle ground, we put in layer 2, and object that is behind, we're gonna put in layer 3. Okay, so this is a different approach as compared to this one. So in this approach, people put the object based by light. Okay, so they will put every single object in the layer, but they will categorize each layer by the light. Okay, so let's give it a play. Okay, so as you can see, like in this particular example, the artist put all the object in layer 1 with the ambient light and render, and the same object put in layer 2 with the directional. I guess they will be used for sunlight, is usually directional, and some volumetric light in the third layer, and some light for this layer, and so on and so on. Okay, so each object will be placed in layer except the light. Okay? The light will be different from one layer to another. That's why the name is categorized by light. Okay, so it's a different approach. Now, this is a very typical render layer if you do FYP, which you're going to be doing in year 3. Okay, so people usually render a character on its own layer, and then they will render the background in a different layer. Okay, depending on the FYP spec and needs, right? You can also use this approach. Okay, you can also use categorize by light approach, or you can also categorize by the object that is in the scene. Okay, and an example, we have the character and we have the background, and we just going to use like the key light as an example, and this is what the rim light look like. This is the key light for the environment. Okay, and this is the key light for the background, and this is the AO. Okay, and when we put all together, this is what the result look like. Okay, and this is a typical FYP layer. So you have the beauty layer or the master layer, and on top of that you have the AO, which I think you should be familiar with this render layer. You have the Z depth. Okay, so for object that is too close or too far from the camera, we're gonna have some kind of blur, and we have some color adjustment, and we also some object ID layer. Okay, a very typical FYP rendering layer setup. Okay, so what's the fuss about render layer? Well, the good thing about render layer is that if you make a mistake, for example, let's say like you make a mistake in a certain frame, okay, because you are using a render layer, right? So let's say like you make a mistake on this character, it's missing his eyeball, and then you don't have to render the whole entire scene, because you actually separate the character and the background separately. Okay, so what you have to do, you only just need to render the character layer only. Okay, so that will save a lot of time when it comes to rendering. Okay, and you also have more control, right? Because you can actually like put color adjustment, right? Let's say like this character is too dark or too bright, you can actually like focus your color adjustment on that region or on that particular selection as compared to this whole picture. If this were a JPEG, right, it's very hard for you to make adjustment because everything is flattened into one layer. Okay, so the more layer you have, the more control you can do. Now, for more complex scene, like we had previously with the Japanese castle, you tend to have a crash when it comes to the rendering. Okay, because it will take longer to render, and during that process, like things may happen. Okay, so if you separate the layer, just like we had here, right? You finish with this one, then you can move on to that one, and maybe the crash happening somewhere around here, but you already saved these two already. Okay, so you only need to re-render this portion. Okay, so having a render layer is a good thing for you. Okay, and the last one is that, let's say you finish all the rendering layer and you want to make some color adjustment. You don't have to re-render the whole thing, because you can select a certain region by using this object ID and just make a color adjustment. Okay, so there are quite a bit of advantage when you're using a render layer. Okay, so this is just an example. So I actually like put this in Photoshop, right, and I put the fill light on top of this key light. Okay, and on top of that one, I put some ambient occlusion. Now, what I did here, I actually just changed the fill light. Okay, so this is like layer number 2, and in Photoshop you have the mode, right? So you can change to color dodge mode, you can change to lighten mode, you can change to this one, that will give you a different result, and you can change the screen. So this is what I mean by can change the color pretty easy, okay, without having to re-render. Otherwise, if you want to change this and everything's in JPEG, everything will be flattened, and you might have to change the texture again, or maybe change the light, right? And you have to re-render the whole thing. Okay, so there will be waste a lot of time. Again, this is what I mean by complex scene. So what people do when it comes to rendering a complex scene like this, they tend to separate these by object. Okay, so you have the foreground, you have the middle ground, and you have the background layer. Okay, so I'm going to play this animation, right? And another advantage of using a render layer is that if you notice this shot, right? Okay, only the character is moving. The camera actually stays. So if you're using a render layer, right, you only need to render the background one time, okay, and render the character separately, okay, as compared to render each frame. Because if you have to re-render each frame, right, then it will take, for both background and the character, they will take too much time. Okay, so what I did here, I actually render the background one time as one separate picture, and I render the character in a different render layer. Okay, then I put all together in After Effects. Okay, so I'm saving a lot of time without having to re-render everything in one go. So if you're using a more traditional method where you render everything in one go, then each frame, each time like this, the character moving, you have to re-render the background and again and again, and it can waste quite a bit of time. Okay, so this is one of the advantage of using render layer. Okay, it's good when it comes to the shot where the camera is not moving, so you can separate the background in one file, and you can separate another file for the character, and you can put all back together. Okay. Again, one thing you have to note is that render layer only work with batch rendering. Okay, so you must click batch render to be able to render the layer. Okay, and one more thing is that render layer is different from render passes. Okay, we usually refer the render passes to A or V. Okay, so this is just one terminology that we're going to be doing in the exercises. So render stat and layer override.